A little girl arrives at the mansion of the wealthiest man in town and says, "You're the one my mother told me to find." When he discovers the reason, he's left speechless and everyone begins to cry. The doorbell rang at 9 in the evening. Richard Calloway frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He set his glass of whiskey on the coffee table and walked across the marble floor of the entrance hall. His reflection multiplied in the mirrors adorning the walls, revealing a tall 50-year-old man with grey hair at the temples and impeccable posture in his Italian suit. The doorbell rang again, more insistently. Richard hated surprises. They rarely brought good news. In his experience as CEO of Calloway Enterprises, the unexpected meant problems. He turned the doorknob and opened the door. No one. Richard looked to both sides, confused. The mansion's garden was silent and dark, lit only by the ornamental lampposts lining the circular driveway. Then he lowered his gaze. A small child stared at him with large brown eyes. A girl of about 6, dark hair tied into 2 simple braids, wearing a faded red coat and holding a unicorn backpack. In her right hand, a folded piece of paper. "May I help you?" Richard asked, unable to hide the surprise in his voice. The little girl didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were examining every detail of Richard's face, as if searching for something familiar. "You're the one my mother told me to find," she finally said, her voice small but determined. A strange chill went through Richard. "Your mother? Who is your mother?" The girl held out the folded paper. "My name is Emily Hudson. My mother's name is Clara." Clara Hudson. That name hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. He felt the air leave his lungs as memories flooded his mind. Clara, wavy brown hair, a radiant smile, eyes that seemed to read his soul. Clara, the summer romance that had ended abruptly 8 years ago. Clara, whom he had deliberately left behind when the company began to take off. "You're Clara's daughter." The words came out uneven. Emily nodded. "Mom's in the hospital. She's very sick and couldn't take care of me anymore." Her childish voice held a seriousness no child should ever know. "She said you could help me." Richard took the paper with trembling fingers and unfolded it. Clara's delicate, familiar handwriting covered the page. "Richard, if you're reading this, it means Emily found you. I know it's a shock, and I'm so sorry for that. I never wanted to show up in your life this way, but I have no choice. I have terminal cancer. The doctors have given me weeks, maybe days. Emily has no one but you. I know it's unfair to ask this after so long, but she is your daughter, Richard. Look at her and you'll see. Please, don't abandon her like you did me. Clara." The last words looked blurred, as if tears had fallen on the paper. Richard lifted his gaze from the note and studied the girl's face. How had he not noticed before? The shape of her chin, the crease between her eyebrows. They were identical to his. "Come in," he said, stepping aside, his mind still processing the impact of the revelation. Emily entered timidly, her footsteps almost inaudible on the cold floor. She looked around, her eyes wide at the size and grandeur of the foyer. "Your house is pretty," she murmured, clutching her backpack to her chest. Richard closed the door, trying to organize his thoughts. He needed to call his lawyer, verify all this, find out which hospital Clara was in. But the little girl in front of him, huddled and tired, needed immediate attention. "Are you hungry?" he asked, surprising even himself with the question. Emily nodded. "I haven't eaten since lunchtime. The social worker brought me straight from the hospital." "Social worker?" "She dropped me off at the gate. She said I should ring the doorbell and give you the note," Emily explained as if it were the most normal procedure. "She's waiting in the car, out there." Richard walked to the window and saw a black car parked across the street. Someone watched the mansion from the driver's seat. He turned back to Emily, who was now looking at the floor. "I need a home," she said quietly, the words coming out as a whisper. "Mom said you might be my dad." The simplicity of that statement hit Richard like no other. In his 50 years, no one had ever needed him in that way. People wanted his money, his influence, his power, but never just him. "Let's talk in the kitchen," Richard said, guiding her down the hallway. I have sandwiches and milk. Then I'll call to speak with your mother. Emily followed in silence. In the brighter light of the stainless steel kitchen, Richard could see the dark circles under the girl's eyes and the tear stains on her cheeks. While opening the fridge, he glanced at Emily, who settled on a tall stool by the kitchen island. She placed her backpack beside her and pulled a worn teddy bear from the side pocket. "This is Mr. Buttons," she explained, noticing Richard's look. "He's sad too, because Mum is sick." Richard felt something strange tighten in his chest. He placed the milk and sandwich ingredients on the counter, trying to ignore the feeling. He had built an empire, negotiated billion-dollar deals, faced hostile board meetings, yet he had no idea how to handle a child, especially one who might be his daughter. A daughter. He had a daughter. As he prepared the sandwich, Richard watched Emily from the corner of his eye. She whispered softly to the teddy bear, talking about the huge house and the serious man who might be her dad. At that moment, looking at the small, solitary figure sitting in his pristine kitchen, Richard Calloway knew his orderly, predictable life had just ended forever. The Metropolitan Hospital was a labyrinth of white hallways and harsh lighting. Richard hated hospitals. The antiseptic smell, the muted sounds of conversations and machinery, the constant sense that life and death were vying for space. He had left Emily with his housekeeper, Mrs. Parker, a middle-aged woman who, despite her surprise, agreed to watch the girl while he handled urgent matters. He hadn't mentioned those matters involved an ex-girlfriend and the possibility he was a father. "Room 407, the receptionist informed after checking the system. "Oncology ward." Oncology. The word pressed on his chest as he walked toward the elevator. Clara had cancer, terminal according to the note. The metal doors closed, and Richard stared at his distorted reflection. He looked older than he had a few hours ago. On the 4th floor, he followed the signs until he found room 407. He hesitated in front of the slightly open door. For a moment, he considered turning back. His life was perfect as it was, organized and predictable. Clara and this child, his child, represented complications he had never planned on. "Are you going to come in or stay out there all day?" The voice, though weak, was unmistakably hers. Richard pushed the door open and entered. Clara lay on a hospital bed, her head propped on white pillows. She was thinner, far thinner than he remembered. Her face, once so full of life, now showed the sharp lines of illness. 4 tubes were attached to her arms, monitors tracking her vital signs. But her eyes, those intense brown eyes that had enchanted him 8 years ago, were the same. "Hello, Richard," she said. "How you still know how to make a dramatic entrance?" He took a few steps toward the bed, unsure what to do. "Clara, Emily found you then," she commented, adjusting herself slightly on the pillows. "I told her you lived in a big house on the hill. You always wanted to live up there, didn't you? To see the whole town at your feet." There was something in the way she spoke, no bitterness, just stating facts, that made Richard feel even worse. "Why didn't you tell me?" His words came out harsher than he intended. "About Emily. She's my daughter, isn't she?" Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Yes, she's your daughter." Richard pulled up a chair and sat down, his head spinning. 6 years, Clara. 6 years, and you never thought it was important to let me know I have a daughter." "And what would you have done?" she asked, her voice calm. "Back then, you were building your empire. The last thing you told me was that you didn't have space in your life for distractions, that you needed to focus." His own words came back to haunt him. He really had said that on their last night together. Clara had mentioned wanting something more serious, maybe starting a family someday, and he had completely dismissed the idea. "I had the right to know," he insisted more quietly. "Maybe." Clara nodded slightly. "But Emily had the right to grow up without feeling like a burden to her father." Silence fell between them. Outside in the hallway, doctors and nurses walked by, the hospital's routine unshaken. "I never wanted to interfere in your life, Richard," Clara continued after a moment. I managed to raise Emily on my own. She's a wonderful girl, smart, strong, stubborn like you." A small smile appeared on her pale lips. "But now, how long?" Richard asked, looking at the monitors, unable to meet Clara's eyes directly. "Weeks, maybe less." Clara took a deep breath, a painful effort. "I tried every treatment. They worked for a while, but the cancer came back aggressively. Now it's just waiting." Richard felt something hot and wet on his cheeks. He touched his face, surprised to find he was crying. He couldn't remember the last time he had cried, perhaps at his father's funeral, more than 20 years ago. "Why now, Clara? Why come to me now?" Clara held out her hand, frail and pale, and Richard took it instinctively. Her skin felt cold. "Because Emily will need someone when I'm gone. She has no one else, Richard. My parents passed away. I have no siblings. The few close friends I have can't take on a child." "And you thought I could," he whispered. "Clara, I don't know how to be a father. I barely know how to talk to a child." Clara squeezed his hand gently. "Because I knew you weren't ready to be a father, but now Emily needs you." Something in those simple words hit him deeply. It wasn't about being ready. It was about need, the need of a child who hadn't asked to be born, who hadn't asked to lose her mother. "I should be mad at you," Richard said, wiping the tears with his suit sleeve, "for hiding this from me for so long." "You have every right to be," Clara agreed, "but don't let that anger affect how you see Emily. She's not responsible for the decisions we made." Richard nodded slowly. "What do I do now?" "Spend time with her," Clara suggested. "Get to know your daughter. She's extraordinary, Richard. Then decide. I know I'm asking a lot, but I need to know she'll have a home when I'm gone." The reality of the situation sank in. Clara was dying. Emily would be left without a mother, and he had to decide whether to take responsibility for a child he barely knew. "What if I can't?" he asked, voice trembling. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, there was determination in them. "Then help find a good family for her, someone who will love her and take care of her as she deserves." She hesitated. "But please, give yourselves a chance, Richard." A nurse entered the room, interrupting. "Time for your medication, Mrs. Hudson, and visiting hours are almost over." Richard stood reluctantly. "I'll come back tomorrow," he promised, uncertain if that was what Clara wanted. She nodded, her gaze conveying more than words could. "Emily likes bedtime stories, and she's afraid of the dark. Leave a small light on." They were practical details. Things a father should know. Richard stored them in his mind, feeling the weight of his new responsibility. "Take care, Clara," he said, stepping away from the bed. "Richard," she called when he was almost at the door. "Thank you for coming." He left the room without responding, a knot in his throat preventing any words. In the hospital corridor, he leaned against the wall, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. His world had crumbled in less than 24 hours. Stepping out into the chilly night, Richard Calloway carried more than just the weight of his own secrets and decisions. He carried the future of a child, his child, and had no idea what to do next. Richard stared at the ceiling of his bedroom, lying in a king-size bed that now felt far too big. The digital clock on the nightstand read 5:17 a.m. He hadn't managed more than 3 hours of sleep. His mind crowded with thoughts of Clara dying in a hospital bed and of the little girl sleeping in the guest room across the hall. His daughter. The word still sounded strange in his mind. He got up, knowing he wouldn't fall back asleep. He put on a robe over his pajamas and walked quietly down the hall. He stopped in front of the door where Emily slept, hesitating. He opened it a crack, just enough to see the small shape under the covers. Emily slept clutching the worn teddy bear, her face serene, unaware of the chaos her arrival had brought to Richard's life. He closed the door and went down to the kitchen, where he made strong coffee. 2 hours later, he heard light footsteps on the stairs. Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in pajamas, her hair messy, holding the teddy bear firmly in one hand. "Good morning," she said, rubbing her eyes. "Can I have some milk?" "Of course," Richard replied awkwardly, standing up. He poured her a glass of milk, feeling strangely formal. "Did you sleep well?" Emily nodded, sitting down at the kitchen table. "The bed is big and soft, but I left the lamp on. Is that okay?" "That's fine," he assured her. There was an awkward silence. Richard had never felt so uneasy in his own home. "Do you want cereal?" "Sure." Emily looked around the kitchen. "Your house is so clean. It looks like a house from a magazine." Richard gave a slight smile. "Mrs. Parker keeps everything in order." "Who's Mrs. Parker?" "My housekeeper. She comes every day except Sundays." Emily sipped her milk, leaving a white line above her lips. "Our house is small. It only has 2 bedrooms and a living room, but Mom lets me draw on the fridge." She paused. "Can I draw on your fridge?" The question caught Richard off guard. Maybe we can find some paper for you to draw on." "Okay." Emily shrugged, now looking at the kitchen window that opened onto the garden. "You have a pool. Can I swim in it?" "I'm not sure," Richard began, but stopped. What could he say? That it wasn't safe? That he didn't want to be bothered? That he was afraid she'd drown? "Maybe later. First you need breakfast." After breakfast, Emily asked to explore the house. Richard agreed, keeping his distance as she wandered from room to room. He noticed how she looked at everything with wonder, especially the artwork and expensive decorative items. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to a modern sculpture in the foyer. "Contemporary art," Richard answered, realizing how pretentious it sounded immediately. Emily tilted her head. "Looks like giant spaghetti." Richard couldn't help but smile. "You know, I've always thought the same thing." The morning passed with Emily exploring every corner of the mansion, asking endless questions. For Richard, who had lived in silence for years, the child's constant curiosity was both exhausting and strangely refreshing. "How many bedrooms are there?" "7. "Why? Do you have a lot of guests?" "Actually, no." "Then why do you need so many bedrooms?" Richard had no answer. He had never questioned the need for so much space for just one person. It was simply what people at his level bought, mansions with too many rooms and empty hallways. Early in the afternoon, he had to make some work calls. He asked Mrs. Parker to keep an eye on Emily, but the girl insisted on staying close to him. She sat quietly on the office couch with a few books Richard found in the library, books he hadn't realized he owned. He tried to focus on work, but his attention kept drifting to the small figure on the couch, now flipping through an illustrated book, moving her lips as she tried to read some words. "Do you work all the time?" she asked, catching him watching her. "Most of the time, yes. Mom works a lot too. She's a nurse, or she was before she got sick." Emily closed the book. "Are you going to see her today? Can I come?" Richard hesitated. "Yes, we'll go later. Right now, I need to finish these calls." The truth was he'd been putting off returning to the hospital. Every minute spent with Emily made it more real that soon she would be his full responsibility. The thought terrified him. The next morning, Richard woke to noises coming from the kitchen. Alarmed, he hurried downstairs, thinking an intruder might have broken in. Instead, he found Emily standing on a stool by the stove, surrounded by an impressive mess. Eggs broken on the floor, flour scattered over the counter, a puddle of spilled milk, and a smell of something burning. "What are you doing?" he asked, astonished. Emily turned around, her face smeared with flour and a radiant smile. "Surprise! I'm making pancakes for you, like Mom does on special days." Richard surveyed the scene, the pristine kitchen now a culinary disaster zone. Emily held a spatula too large for her small hands, trying to flip something unrecognizable in the pan. "It's almost done," she assured him. "I just wasn't sure if I was supposed to put the eggshell in or not." Richard didn't know how to react at first. His initial impulse was annoyance, the mess, the waste, the invasion of his neat space. But then he saw the hopeful look in Emily's eyes, the way she'd tried so hard to do something special for him. "Let me help," he said, surprising himself. He moved closer and took the spatula. Pancakes can be tricky. Maybe we should start with something simpler. You're not mad, she asked, biting her lip. No, he replied, realizing it was true. But next time, tell me before using the stove, okay? It can be dangerous. Together, they cleaned up the mess and made a simple breakfast. Richard showed Emily how to crack eggs properly and measure ingredients. It was the first time he'd cooked with anyone since Clara, years ago. While they ate, Richard watched Emily devour her scrambled eggs enthusiastically. "Why do you live alone in such a big house?" she asked suddenly. The question, innocent and direct as only a child can ask, caught Richard off guard. "I like having space," he replied, realizing how empty it sounded. Emily chewed thoughtfully. "But isn't it sad? Mum says people shouldn't be alone. That's why we have neighbors and friends." Richard didn't know how to respond. Instead, he gathered the empty plates and took them to the sink. "Let's get dressed," he said. "We're going to see your mom today. Remember?" Emily nodded happily, hopping down from her chair. Before leaving the kitchen, she stopped and looked at Richard. "Thanks for helping me with breakfast." That was fun. It was such a simple comment, but it affected Richard in an unexpected way. When was the last time anyone had found his company fun? When was the last time he'd had fun doing something so simple as making breakfast? As Emily ran off to get dressed, Richard remained in the kitchen, reflecting on how a 6-year-old was slowly finding cracks in a wall he'd spent decades building. Richard sat on the back patio of his mansion, watching Emily play in the garden. Mrs. Parker had found an old ball in storage, and now the girl ran across the perfectly manicured lawn, chasing it with the boundless energy only children have. A week had passed since Emily had shown up at his door. A week of daily hospital visits, quiet dinners and small discoveries about his daughter, like the fact that she hated carrots, loved adventure stories, and talked to her teddy bear as if it were a real person. Richard sipped his whiskey, letting his mind drift to the past. 8 years earlier, when he met Clara, she had been working at the university hospital where Richard was admitted after a collapse from exhaustion. At the time, he was busy turning the mid-sized company he had inherited from his father into an international conglomerate, 18-hour workdays, 7 days a week. Clara was the nurse on the night shift. "You need to learn to slow down," she had said, checking his vitals. "Otherwise, you'll be back here with something worse than exhaustion." He recalled feeling irritated by her directness. People usually didn't confront him, but Clara Hudson wasn't intimidated by titles or bank balances. She treated him as she would any other patient, with professional firmness and genuine compassion. On the 3rd night of his hospital stay, they talked for hours. Clara had finished her shift but stopped by his room before leaving. Richard learned she had majored in literature before becoming a nurse, that she loved old jazz, and that her laughter seemed to light up the entire room. When he was discharged, he asked her out to dinner. To his surprise, she declined. "I don't date my patients," she explained. "It's a rule of mine." "What about ex-patients?" he asked, with a smile he rarely showed. Clara considered it for a moment. "Call me in 2 weeks. If you still want to take me to dinner, we'll talk." He called exactly 2 weeks later, and 2 weeks after that, he took her to the best restaurant in town. But Clara seemed uncomfortable with the formal setting and the exorbitant prices. On their second date, she picked the venue, a small jazz club downtown where the musicians played just a few feet from the tables. The summer passed like a dream. Clara made him laugh, challenged him, pulled him out of his comfort zone. With her, Richard was not the CEO of Callaway Enterprises, not the business mogul featured in financial magazines. He was simply Richard, a man discovering at 42 that perhaps there was more to life than quarterly reports and corporate takeovers. But then autumn arrived, along with a business opportunity that required all his attention, a merger that could triple the company's value. Clara began to notice the missed calls, the last-minute cancelled dinners, the distant look in Richard's eyes even when they were together. "You're always somewhere else," she said one October evening, as he checked his email for the 5th time during dinner. "Physically here, but mentally there." Richard put his phone aside. "It's temporary. The merger is at a critical stage. Everything in your life is temporary, Richard, except your work." She didn't speak angrily. She merely sounded resigned, as if she had finally accepted a truth she had been trying to deny. A week later, Clara spoke about the future. Maybe marriage someday, maybe children. That was when Richard said the words that now haunted him. "I don't have room in my life for distractions right now. I need to focus on what's important." The look on Clara's face that night, the way her smile vanished, how her eyes lost their shine, was etched into his memory. "I see," she said, rising from the table. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Richard. I truly do." That was the last time he saw her, until now. "Richard, you seem far away." The voice of Jonathan's, his personal assistant for over 10 years, brought him back to the present. The younger man had just arrived, carrying a folder of documents. Richard nodded toward the chair beside him. "Just remembering a few things." Jonathan sat down, throwing a quick glance at Emily in the garden. "The results are in," he said, handing Richard an envelope. Richard took the envelope but didn't open it immediately. 3 days ago, at his lawyer's urging, he had requested a DNA test, a formality, the lawyer insisted, necessary for establishing paternity legally, in case the worst happened. "Do you want me to step out?" Jonathan asked, noticing his hesitation. "No." Richard opened the envelope and took out the official paper. His eyes scanned the medical jargon until they found the result. The probability of paternity was 99.98%. Emily was, without a doubt, his biological daughter. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, letting the information settle. He already knew, of course. He only had to look at Emily to see the similarities, not just physical, but the way she furrowed her brow when focused, the slight tilt of her head when intrigued. "Is it the expected result?" Jonathan asked carefully. "Yes." Richard put the paper back in the envelope. "She's my daughter." Jonathan nodded, unsurprised. He knew Richard well enough to expect him to take responsibility. "The lawyer is preparing the guardianship documents," Jonathan continued. "Given Ms. Hudson's condition, the process will be expedited. But," he hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "But what?" "He mentioned that you have options. The law doesn't force a father to take custody if he doesn't feel prepared. There are alternatives." Richard looked at Emily, who was now lying on the grass and staring at the clouds. "What sort of alternatives?" "Well, Ms. Hudson listed an aunt in her medical records, someone named Margaret Fisher, who lives in Seattle. They're not close, and from what I understand, but she is a relative. The lawyer suggested that if you prefer, we can contact her." The idea of sending Emily to live with a distant aunt she barely knew squeezed Richard's chest. An Aunt Clara hadn't considered close enough to be her first option. "Or there's the adoption system," Jonathan continued, his professional tone contrasting with the delicate subject. "Young children like Emily are usually adopted quickly, especially since she's, well, healthy and without behavioral issues." Richard raised his hand, stopping him. The thought of Emily in the foster care system, waiting for strangers to take her in, was unbearable. "Just prepare the guardianship papers," he said, more brusquely than intended. Jonathan nodded, putting away the documents. "Richard," he said, hesitant, "may I speak frankly?" "When do you not?" A small smile appeared on the assistant's face. "I've known you for over a decade. I've seen you build an empire. You've closed deals others thought impossible. But you're not sure I can take care of a child," Richard finished. "That's not it," Jonathan corrected. "It's that you've always prioritized things you can measure and control. Spreadsheets, profit margins, stocks, things you can maneuver with your brilliant mind." He paused. "A child isn't like that. There's no manual, no guaranteed strategy." Richard watched Emily, who was now standing and running after a butterfly. "I'm aware," he said. "Maybe that's exactly why I'm hesitant." "Hesitant or afraid?" Richard shot Jonathan a sharp look. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by employees, but Jonathan occupied a peculiar role somewhere between assistant and confidant. If anyone could speak truth to Richard Calloway, it was him. "Both," Richard admitted. "I don't know how to be a father. I never wanted to be a father." "With all due respect, sir, I think the real problem isn't that," Jonathan said, leaning slightly forward. "The problem is that you're afraid of failure. In your life, you've only allowed yourself to do things you were sure you'd excel at, carefully calculating every risk." The words hit Richard hard. It was true. He had built his life and career by choosing battles he knew he could win, calculating every move meticulously. "What if I fail her?" he whispered. "If I'm not the father she needs?" Jonathan offered a small smile. "This might be the first time you have something more precious than money, something you can't control with business strategies. And that's terrifying." Richard studied his assistant, surprised by the insight. It was exactly that. Emily represented a type of risk he'd never faced before, the risk of loving someone unconditionally and still failing. "She looks like her mother," Richard commented, watching Emily, who was now approaching with something in her hands. "I'd say she has a lot of you, too," Jonathan replied, standing up. The same determination in her eyes. Emily arrived, cupping her hands. "Look what I found," she exclaimed, opening them to reveal a small ladybug. "Can I keep it?" Richard exchanged glances with Jonathan. "Wild creatures should stay in nature, Emily. But we can build a little house for it in the garden, if you like." Emily's eyes lit up. "Really?" "Sure, Jonathan can help us find the materials." Richard stood. "Go put the ladybug back in the grass, and then we can start." As Emily ran back to the garden, Jonathan turned to Richard. "For someone who doesn't know how to be a father, you seem to be doing just fine," he observed. "It was just a simple answer about a ladybug," Richard said, looking away. "That's how it begins," Jonathan replied, with a knowing smile. "Small answers to small questions, small decisions that eventually become big ones." After Jonathan left, Richard returned to his office. There was work piling up, emails unanswered, calls to return. But instead of opening his laptop, he found himself at the window, watching Emily in the garden, now helping Mrs. Parker pick flowers. He picked up the DNA test results, reading them again. The clinical, precise language confirmed what his heart already knew. Emily was his daughter, his blood, his responsibility. Richard remembered his own father, a distant man, always busy, rarely present at important events. A man who showed love by providing material comforts, but never time or attention. Richard had vowed to be different if he ever had children. Then he decided never to have them, avoiding the risk of becoming like his father. But now fate was giving him a choice. He could send Emily to live with a distant aunt, a stranger who shared only Clara's last name. He could justify it as being best for the girl, growing up in a real family, with someone who knew how to care for children. Or he could try. He could face his fear of failure, his fear of repeating his father's mistakes. He could give Emily a home, not just a big, luxurious house, but a true home. Richard put the test results in his drawer and looked at the photo on his desk, a framed picture of him receiving a Business Person of the Year award 2 years prior. In the photo, he wore the practiced smile he reserved for public occasions, holding a crystal trophy that now collected dust on some shelf. Next to that formal photo, there was now a brightly colored, crooked drawing Emily had made the previous night. "Me and you," read the childlike handwriting, showing 2 stick figures, one large, one small, holding hands. Richard ran his fingertips over the drawing, feeling an unnamed emotion. In the garden, Emily laughed at something Mrs. Parker said. Her laughter drifted through the open window, light, clear, unburdened. So much like Clara's laugh. Maybe Jonathan was right. Maybe, for the first time in his life, Richard Calloway had found something truly precious, something money couldn't buy or power couldn't control, something that required not his sharp mind or fierce determination, but his heart. Something more valuable than money. The unmistakable smell of hospital antiseptic filled Richard's nostrils as soon as the automatic doors opened. Emily gripped his hand tightly, hugging her teddy bear to her chest with the other arm. She wore a blue dress Mrs. Parker had bought the day before, and her hair was tied in a simple braid. "Remember what we talked about?" Richard asked, lowering himself to her eye level. Emily nodded. "That Mom is very weak and needs peace and quiet." "That's right. And we can't stay long because she needs to rest." The girl looked down the white hallway, her small face suddenly serious. "She's going to get better, isn't she?" Richard felt a lump in his throat. The doctors had been clear on the last visit. Clara was deteriorating rapidly. The cancer had spread to her liver, and her body was no longer responding to treatments. It was a matter of days, maybe a week. "Let's hope so," he said, unable to lie outright but also lacking the courage to tell the whole truth. In the elevator, Emily was quiet, shifting slightly on her heels. Since Richard brought her to his home 2 weeks ago, she'd asked about her mother every day. Even with frequent hospital visits, Emily missed Clara intensely. Richard wondered what would happen to her when Clara was gone. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that her mother would never come home? How do you comfort her through a grief he himself had never truly experienced? The door to room 407 was ajar. Richard knocked softly before entering, Emily almost hiding behind him. "Clara, can we come in?" A weak voice answered from inside. "Sure, come in." Richard pushed the door open, and the antiseptic smell grew stronger. Clara was lying in the hospital bed, even thinner than the week before. Her face had taken on a yellowish tone, and although her eyes were still alert, they were sunken in deep circles. An IV bag was connected to her arm, monitors beeping at an irregular pace that hardly felt comforting. "Hi," Clara said, trying to smile. Her gaze shifted past Richard and landed on Emily, who remained partly hidden behind him. "Hey, Princess." "Mom!" Emily let go of Richard's hand and ran to the bed, stopping only when the nurse made a discreet gesture. "Watch the tubes, sweetie," the nurse said gently. "You can hug your mum, but be careful." Emily nodded solemnly and approached the bed with measured steps. Clara opened her arms, and the girl leaned in for a careful hug. "I've missed you so much," Clara murmured, kissing the top of Emily's head. "Me too, Mom. Why can't you just get better so we can go home?" Clara glanced at Richard, who stepped closer to the bed. "The nurse will get you a stool to sit on, Emily," he said, "so you can stay close to your mum." The nurse nodded and left the room, returning moments later with a small stool that she placed beside the bed. Emily climbed onto it, placing Mr. Buttons on the covers. "I brought Mr. Buttons to keep you company," Emily explained. "He missed you too." Clara smiled and touched the worn teddy bear. "Thank you, sweetie. He'll help me feel better." Richard stepped back a bit, giving mother and daughter some space. Clara listened attentively as Emily talked about the new house, the big garden, the pool she still hadn't used, and how Mrs. Parker made really good pancakes, but not as good as hers. "Is Richard nice?" Clara asked, glancing briefly at him. Emily thought for a second. "He's quiet, but he helped me build a house for a ladybug in the garden, and he didn't get mad when I spilled juice on the rug." Clara laughed softly, though it seemed to cost her effort. "That's good." Richard noticed how different she was from the vibrant woman he had known years ago. The illness had stolen not only her health, but also that lively energy she once radiated. Still, when Clara looked at Emily, her eyes regained some of their old glow. After about 20 minutes of conversation, Clara began to show signs of exhaustion. Her breathing grew heavier, and she closed her eyes for a few moments. "Emily," Richard said, "how about going to the cafeteria to buy some juice? Your mother and I need to talk for a bit." The girl looked uncertainly from Richard to Clara. "It's all right," Clara assured her. "Come back in a few minutes with your juice, and we'll finish our talk." Emily agreed reluctantly. Richard called a nurse's aide in the hallway, and asked her to escort the girl to the cafeteria. When they were alone, he moved closer to the bed. "How are you feeling?" he asked, knowing it was a silly question but not sure what else to say. "I've been better," Clara answered, with a ghost of her old sarcasm. "The doctors are kind, but I know my time is running out." Richard sat in the chair beside her bed. "Don't say that. We have to be realistic, Richard, for Emily." Clara paused, breathing with difficulty. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" He knew exactly what she meant. "Yes, I'll take care of her." Clara's face lit up with relief and hope. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel obligated." "It's not an obligation," he replied, surprised to realize it was the truth. "She's my daughter." Clara held out her hand and Richard took it, her skin cold and fragile as paper. "You were always determined once you made up your mind," she said. "That was one of the things that attracted me to you. That absolute certainty, that confidence." She gave a sad smile. "Even when you decided to leave me behind." Richard lowered his eyes. "Clara, No," she interrupted. "This isn't the time for regrets or apologies. The past is done. What matters now is the future. Emily's future." Clara squeezed his hand softly. "You know she can be difficult sometimes, right? Stubborn as a mule. When she sets her mind on something, there's no changing it." "Like her mother," Richard observed. "Like her father," Clara corrected with a small smile. "She also has nightmares. Not too often, but when she does, they're intense. Leaving a small light on helps." Richard nodded, making a mental note. "She loves music too. She's been taking piano lessons for a year. Her teacher says she has talent." "I have a piano at home," Richard said. "I haven't played for years, but we can find her a teacher." Clara looked pleased, then her face turned serious. "Richard, I know I made a mistake not telling you about her. I was hurt and selfish. I thought I was protecting Emily, but maybe I was also punishing you for leaving me." She took a deep breath. "I'm sorry for that. It doesn't matter anymore," he replied. "It does matter, because now you have a chance to do things differently, to choose your daughter above everything else." Tears filled Clara's eyes. "Despite our mistakes, yours and mine, you have the chance to make it right now. Please, don't waste it." Before Richard could answer, Emily returned, holding a cup of orange juice carefully. Her eyes darted between the two adults, as if trying to gauge the emotional temperature of the room. "Mum, when are you coming back home?" she asked, approaching the bed again. Clara inhaled, trying not to show how much that question hurt. "I don't know, sweetheart. The doctors are trying to help me get better, but it's complicated. But you will get better, right? You promised you'd come see me dance at the school show next month." Richard saw the effort it took Clara not to cry. He, too, felt a tightening in his chest at Emily's innocence, her inability to grasp the gravity of the situation. "Emily," Clara spoke gently, "sometimes people get too sick, and not even the best doctors can make them better." The girl furrowed her brow. "But you're strong. You always say we're strong." "Yes, we are," Clara smiled, touching her daughter's cheek. "But some battles can't be won, no matter how hard we try." Emily clung to her mother's arm, tears pooling in her eyes. "I don't want you to stay in the hospital. I want you at home, making pancakes and reading stories." Clara hugged her daughter with what little strength she had, looking over Emily's head at Richard, a silent plea in her eyes. He stepped forward and placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Your mom needs rest now, Emily. We can come back tomorrow." "No." The girl clung more tightly to her mother. "I want to stay here." "Emily," Clara said firmly, though her voice was weak, "be a good girl for Richard, okay? It'll help me get better." Reluctantly, Emily pulled away, silent tears rolling down her face. "Promise you'll get better." Clara looked at her daughter, a battle of emotions in her eyes. "I promise I'll try with all my strength." A nurse entered, announcing the end of visiting hours and that Clara needed to rest. Richard took Emily's hand. "See you tomorrow, Mum," the girl said, reluctant to leave. "See you tomorrow, my love." Clara kissed her forehead. "Be a good girl." Richard exchanged one last look with Clara before leaving. So much remained unsaid between them, so many things that might never be resolved. But in that look was a mutual understanding, a silent commitment that, regardless of the past, Emily's future would be their priority. In the car, Emily was quiet, clutching Mr. Buttons. Richard drove slowly, struggling to find words of comfort, but none seemed adequate. "She's not going to get better, is she?" Emily asked suddenly, her small voice breaking the silence of the car. Richard felt the impact of the question. The girl was more perceptive than she appeared. He considered lying, saying everything would be fine, but something stopped him. "I don't know, Emily," he answered honestly. "The doctors are doing their best." She nodded, as though she already knew the answer. "If she doesn't get better, can I stay with you?" The direct, vulnerable question hit him hard. "Yes, you'll always have a place with me." When they got home, Emily refused dinner. She went straight to the guest room, closing the door behind her. Richard respected her space, knowing she needed to process everything in her own way. Hours later, while working in his office, he heard a muffled sound coming from Emily's room. He walked to the door and listened. She was crying, not the dramatic crying of a tantrum, but deep, wrenching sobs. Richard hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. What could he say? How could he comfort a pain so profound? He'd never been good with emotions, always preferring practical solutions to tangible problems. Finally, he opened the door. Emily lay curled up on the bed, hugging Mr. Buttons, her small body shaking with sobs. "Emily?" he called softly. She looked at him, her face red and wet with tears. "I want my mom," she said, her voice choked by crying. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, unsure of what to do. Hesitantly, he reached out and touched her shoulder. To his surprise, Emily threw herself into his arms, burying her face in his chest. "I'm scared," she confessed through sobs. "I'm scared Mom won't come home." Richard held her, feeling his heart constrict with the child's pain. He realized there were no words for this. No phrase could diminish the anguish of a child fearing the loss of her mother. Instead of talking, he just held her. He rearranged himself on the bed, leaning against the headboard, and let Emily cry in his arms. Occasionally, he stroked her hair or rubbed gentle circles on her back, the way he remembered his own mother doing when he was small. Minutes turned into hours. Emily's crying eventually subsided, but she refused to let go of Richard. He stayed there, his muscles stiffening from the awkward position, resisting the urge to move. At some point during the night, Emily finally fell asleep, exhausted by her tears. Richard could have gotten up then, gone to his own room or back to his work, but he didn't. He remained there, watching his daughter's sleeping face, tears still drying on her cheeks, her chest rising and falling in a soft rhythm. In that moment, Richard understood something all his years of business success had not taught him. Sometimes the most important thing you can give someone is simply your presence. There were no magic solutions for Emily's pain, no words to make everything better. But there was him, imperfect, inexperienced, scared, yet present. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Richard closed his eyes, still holding Emily in his arms, and for the first time in a long while, allowed himself to fully feel the vulnerability of the moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult decisions, the relentless reality of Clara's illness. But for now, tonight, he was just a father comforting his daughter. And somehow, that felt like the most important thing he'd ever done. The phone rang at 6 in the morning. Richard was in his private gym in the mansion's basement, trying to burn off the tension of the past few weeks by running on the treadmill. He slowed down, panting, and grabbed his cell phone from the side shelf. The hospital's number. His stomach sank. "Hello? Mr. Calloway?" Dr. Peterson, Clara's oncologist, sounded somber. "I'm sorry to call so early, but there was a change in Miss Hudson's condition overnight." Richard stopped the treadmill completely, steadying himself with one hand on the machine. What happened? She experienced kidney failure. We managed to stabilize her, but... The doctor paused almost imperceptibly. It's not a good sign. Her body is starting to shut down. How long? The question came out in a whisper. It's hard to say, but I'd guess we're talking about days, not weeks. She's conscious now and asked to see you. Specifically, she asked you to bring Emily. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. We'll be there in an hour. He hung up, standing motionless for a few seconds, sweat still dripping down his face. In recent days, Emily had regained a bit of energy. They had established a routine, breakfast together. Then Mrs. Parker would take her on short outings while Richard worked, a hospital visit in the afternoon, dinner, and a bedtime story. The girl still had sad moments, but she seemed to be adjusting. Now he had to tell her her mother was getting worse, that the end was near. Richard climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavy. He took a quick shower and dressed simply, jeans and a blue shirt. This wasn't a day for suits. He stopped outside Emily's door, took a deep breath, and knocked softly. Emily, are you awake? No response. He opened the door a crack. The girl was still asleep, hugging Mr. Buttons tightly, a small lamp providing soft light in the room. Richard sat on the edge of the bed and gently touched her shoulder. Emily, wake up. We need to talk. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking away sleep. Is it time to get up? Yes, Richard tried to keep his voice steady. We have to visit your mom earlier today. The doctor called. Emily sat up immediately, fully awake. Is Mom worse? Richard hesitated. How could he explain? She's a bit weaker today. She wants to see us. The girl jumped out of bed and ran to the closet. I'll get dressed really fast. Emily, he didn't know how to prepare her. Your mom might look different today, more tired. I want you to be ready for that. She stopped, a sock in her hand, and looked at him with eyes that seemed far older than her 6 years. I know, she's dying, isn't she? The direct question hit him like a punch. The doctors are doing what they can. Emily nodded, as if that non-answer was enough confirmation. I'll wear the yellow dress she likes. 40 minutes later, they were in the car. Emily insisted on bringing not just Mr. Buttons, but also a drawing she had made the night before. A colorful picture of her, Clara and Richard, all holding hands under a bright smiling sun. It's for her to put next to the bed, Emily explained, so she can look at it when she's alone. The hospital seemed colder and more desolate that morning. They went straight up to Clara's room, where a nurse waited by the door. She's conscious but very weak, the nurse said in a low voice. Please try not to tire her out. Richard nodded and took Emily's hand, which she squeezed with surprising strength. Upon entering the room, the impact was immediate. Clara was almost unrecognizable. Her face, once merely thin, was now gaunt. Her skin pulled tight over bone, her lips dry and pale. Tubes and more tubes connected to her body, monitors beeping in a pattern too irregular to be reassuring. Emily froze at the door, trembling. Richard felt it, too. Hello, Clara said, her voice barely a raspy whisper. Her eyes, however, remained alert, focused on her daughter. Come here, my love. Emily glanced at Richard, as though asking for permission or courage. He gently nodded, and she walked over to the bed, still holding his hand. I brought a drawing, the girl said, lifting the colorful paper. It's the three of us. Clara managed a faint smile, though the effort seemed enormous. It's lovely. Will you put it where I can see it? Richard took the drawing and propped it on the bedside table, making sure it was visible to Clara. She watched, then turned her gaze back to Emily. Come closer, she asked. I want to see you properly. Emily let go of Richard's hand and moved nearer to the bed. Clara raised a trembling hand and touched her daughter's face. You're the most beautiful thing I ever made, she said, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. The most important thing. Don't cry, Mom, Emily pleaded, her own voice breaking. "It'll be okay." Clara looked at Richard, who now stood at Emily's side. "You're in good hands, sweetheart. Richard will take care of you." "But I want you," Emily insisted, her voice tinged with growing desperation. "I want you to get better and come home." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, breathing heavily. Richard placed a hand on Emily's shoulder, worrying she was pushing her mother too far. But Clara opened her eyes again, determined to continue. "Emily, remember the story I used to read to you? About the star that goes to live in the sky?" The girl nodded, tears now rolling down her little face. "Sometimes the people we love have to go live in the sky too. But they still watch over us from up there, protecting us, loving us." "I don't want you to go to the sky," Emily sobbed, clinging to Clara's hand. "I want you to stay here with me." "I want that too," Clara whispered, her voice nearly inaudible. "More than anything in the world, but we don't always get to choose, my love." She looked at Richard, her eyes conveying a silent request. He stepped forward and gently began to pull Emily away from the bed. "We should let your mom rest a bit, okay? We can go get some juice and come back later." "No," Emily clung to the bed. "I don't want to leave." "It's okay," Clara said. "Let her stay." Richard hesitated, but agreed. Clara motioned for him to come closer. "I want to talk to you too," she said so quietly he had to lean in. "Emily, sweetheart, can you show Mr. Buttons the drawing by the window?" "Just for a moment." Emily nodded reluctantly and moved away a few steps with her teddy bear. Clara held Richard's hand with surprising strength. "She's going to need you so much," she whispered. "In the coming days, in the coming weeks, in the coming years." "I'll be there," he promised. "I'll do my best." "I know you will. You've always done the best you could, Richard. Even when you left us." She gave a sad smile. "There's a box in my apartment among my things, a blue box with important documents. There's something in there for you." "Clara, don't talk like—" "I'm dying, Richard," she said bluntly, silencing him. "We both know it. And there are things you need to know, things you should have known years ago. In the box." She looked over at Emily, who was showing every detail of the drawing to her teddy bear. "Promise you won't pull away from her after I'm gone. She'll try to push you away. She'll be angry. She'll hurt. Please promise you won't give up on her." "I promise," Richard said, holding her hand with both of his. Clara nodded, appearing satisfied. Then she closed her eyes. "I'm so tired." "Rest," he whispered. "We'll come back later." "Richard." Her voice was barely a breath now. "In another life, you and I would have worked out." He felt tears burn his eyes. "Yes, we would have." Clara drifted into sleep, exhausted by the effort of speaking. Richard stayed by her side for a few more minutes, just holding her hand, while Emily quietly approached and rested her head on his arm. "She'll be sleeping a lot today," he explained softly. "We'll come back later." Emily nodded without protesting. As they left the room, she turned back for one last look at her mother. In the hallway, they ran into Dr. Peterson, who gave Richard a significant look. "May I speak with you in private?" Richard asked Emily to wait with a nurse, then followed the doctor into a small consultation room. "Mr. Calloway, I think it's important to be candid. Ms. Hudson is in the terminal stage. The cancer has spread to multiple organs, and now with kidney failure." He paused. "We're providing comfort, but there's nothing more medically we can do." Richard nodded, the reality settling in completely. "How long?" "Days, maybe just hours." He felt a chill wash over his body. "Is she in pain?" "We're managing it. She'll gradually become sleepier until she simply doesn't wake up." The doctor placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry." Richard thanked him mechanically and returned to the hallway, where Emily waited. She looked at him, and he knew, somehow, she understood what was happening. "Let's go home," he said, extending his hand. "We'll come back later to see if your mom's awake." But Clara didn't wake that day, nor the next. She slipped into a coma in the early hours of the third day after that visit, and passed away the following evening, quietly, while Richard sat by her bed. Emily wasn't there. He had just taken her home after spending hours at the hospital. The girl was exhausted, and Clara had shown no signs of consciousness for 2 days. A nurse noticed first, coming in to check the vital signs. "I'm sorry, Mr. Calloway, she's gone." Richard remained seated for several minutes, holding Clara's hand as it began to cool. He couldn't cry, couldn't move. He thought of everything that might have been, every choice that led to this moment. What followed was a blur. Doctors confirming the death, paperwork to be signed, funeral arrangements to be made. Richard went through the motions like an automaton. All he really worried about was how to tell Emily. When he arrived home, it was after midnight. Mrs. Parker was waiting in the living room, a concerned look on her face. "Emily's asleep," she told him. "I finally got her to drink some chamomile tea and lie down." "Clara passed away," Richard said, the words sounding as though they belonged to someone else. Mrs. Parker put a hand over her mouth. "Oh my God, that poor girl." She hesitated. "How will you tell her?" Richard shook his head. "I don't know, but it has to be tomorrow. I can't let her find out any other way." He climbed the stairs slowly and paused at Emily's door, opening it just a crack to confirm she was asleep. Her face looked peaceful in slumber, unaware of the devastating loss she had just suffered. Richard went to his own room but couldn't sleep. He sat in an armchair by the window, gazing at the starry sky, wondering if Clara was really out there somewhere, as she had told Emily. The next morning, he entered Emily's room before she woke up. He sat on the edge of the bed and waited. When she opened her eyes and saw him sitting there silently, something in his face must have conveyed the news, because she sat up immediately. "Mom," she asked, her voice small and frightened. Richard swallowed hard. "Emily, I have something very sad to tell you." He took a deep breath. "Your mom passed away last night." She wasn't in any pain. It was like falling asleep. Emily remained frozen for a long moment, as though she hadn't understood. Then, slowly, tears began streaming down her face. No sobs, no screams, just silent tears that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. Richard pulled her close, and she didn't resist. She hugged him with all her strength, burying her face in his chest. "Did she go to heaven?" she finally asked, her voice muffled in his shirt. "Yes," he answered without hesitation. "She went to heaven." Emily cried for a long time, until she fell asleep again in Richard's arms. He laid her down gently and stayed by her side, watching her restless sleep. The days that followed were hazy. The funeral was small and simple, just as Clara would have wanted. Emily refused to speak throughout the entire service, clinging to Richard's hand as though it were her only anchor in a world that had just collapsed. When they returned home, Emily went straight to her room and closed the door. She refused to come out for dinner. She refused breakfast the next day, and the next, and the next. Mrs. Parker left trays of food outside her door 3 times a day, but they were mostly untouched. Emily had lost weight, and the dark circles under her eyes revealed sleepless nights. Richard tried talking to her through the door, but she rarely answered. On the 4th day after the funeral, Richard was in his office, trying to focus on work emails, when Jonathan knocked on the door. "Ms. Hudson's personal belongings arrived from the hospital," he reported, "and there are also some boxes from her apartment." "The social worker arranged it all," Richard nodded. "Put them in the downstairs guest room, please." "I'll go through them later." Jonathan hesitated. "If I might suggest, maybe some of her mother's belongings could help Emily feel more connected. Something familiar, something that still smells like her." Richard considered the idea. "You're right. I'll see what I can find." That night, after yet another failed attempt at getting Emily to come out of her room, Richard went through Clara's possessions. There weren't many: clothes, some books, a small collection of jazz CDs, a few makeup items. A whole life reduced to a handful of boxes. In a blue document box, he found what Clara had mentioned. Emily's birth certificate, medical records, insurance documents, and an envelope, yellowed with age, bearing his name in Clara's elegant handwriting. Richard sat on the edge of the guest bed and opened the envelope carefully. The letter was dated 8 years ago, just a few months after their breakup. "Dear Richard, if you're reading this, it means something happened to me and Emily is now in your care. There's a lot you don't know, and that I should have told you before. When we broke up, I was already 2 months pregnant. I didn't know it yet, or maybe I chose not to know. I discovered it weeks later, and my first reaction was to call you. I even dialed your number but hung up before you could answer. It wasn't out of pride or anger, though I was hurt by the end of our relationship. It was because, that same week, I had an unexpected visitor, your mother, Eleanor. She came to my apartment one afternoon. She said she knew about us, that she'd always known. She said you were about to close the biggest opportunity of your life with the merger, and that any complication could ruin everything. I didn't mention the pregnancy. I was still in shock from the discovery. But somehow, she suspected. If you really love him, you'll let him go his own way, she told me. Richard wasn't born to be a family man. He was born to run empires. I confronted her, said that you had the right to know, to choose. She laughed and replied, "He's already chosen, dear. He said there was no room in his life for distractions." Those words, your words, hit me deeply. Maybe because, deep down, I feared they were true. That you really saw our love and the possibility of a family as distractions from your real purpose. Eleanor offered me money to go away, to start over somewhere else. I refused, of course. I left town not because of her, but because I needed to think, to decide what to do. When Emily was born, I almost called you again. Many times over the years, I almost looked for you. But whenever I thought of doing it, I remembered your priorities, your ambition, and I wondered if you would really have space in your life for us. Now that I'm gone, you need to know the whole truth. Not so you'll resent your mother, but so you'll understand that things aren't always as they seem. Sometimes the people we love most make decisions for us, believing they know what's best. Please, don't make the same mistake with Emily. Don't let others decide what's important in your life. Don't let ambition or fear or someone else's opinion determine how much you'll allow yourself to love her. Emily is the best of both of us. I hope that, in getting to know her, you'll discover a part of yourself you never knew existed. With love, even after everything sat, Clara. Richard let the letter fall into his lap, stunned. His mother had interfered. She had convinced Clara not to tell him about the pregnancy. She had manipulated their lives based on her own convictions of what was best for him. Anger rose in his throat, hot and bitter. Not just anger at his mother, but at himself, for being so predictable, so easily manipulated, for giving Eleanor the ammunition she used against Clara, his own words about distractions and priorities. Without thinking, he picked up the phone and dialed his mother's number. Though it was late, she answered on the third ring. "Richard, is something wrong?" "You knew about Clara," he said without preamble. "You knew she was pregnant." The silence on the other end was confession enough. "Richard, You convinced her not to tell me, to stay away." Eleanor sighed. "I did what I thought was best for you. That merger was crucial, and you were so close to achieving everything you'd always dreamed of. A girl and a baby would have ruined it." "It wasn't your decision to make." Richard's voice rose, and he struggled to keep it down, mindful that Emily could hear. "It was my life, my choice." "You'd already chosen," Eleanor responded coldly. "Or are you going to tell me you would have given it all up for her? Abandoned your dreams for a nurse and an unplanned baby?" Richard stood up, gripping the phone so tightly his fingers hurt. "I'll never know, will I? Because you made that decision for me." "I did what a mother does," Eleanor insisted. "I protected your future." "No, Mom, you destroyed my family. And now I have a 6-year-old daughter who just lost her mother, and I barely know her." Another long silence. "I'm sorry you're angry," Eleanor finally said, "but in time, you'll see I did the best for everyone." Richard shook his head, even though she couldn't see him. "No, Mom. You did what was most convenient for you and your idea of what my life should be." He took a deep breath. "Don't call me for a while. I need to figure out how to be a father, and I don't need your version of it." He hung up before she could reply. He sat back down, the letter still on his lap, his head spinning with revelations and lost possibilities. His life could have been completely different. He could have been there for Clara's pregnancy, seen Emily's birth, witnessed her first steps and first words. He could have built a family instead of just an empire. Or maybe his mother was right. Maybe he would have chosen ambition anyway. Maybe he would have become an absent father, always too busy, always mentally elsewhere. Richard looked toward the door, thinking of Emily isolated in her room, buried in her grief. He thought of Clara, how she'd raised an incredible child on her own, even knowing she might not live to see her grow up. In that moment, Richard Calloway understood he faced a crucial choice. He could follow the path his mother had laid out for him, prioritizing business, success, recognition, or he could choose a different path, one where Emily came first, where he learned how to be the father she deserved. He rose, placed Clara's letter carefully aside, and picked up one of her coats, a soft wool garment that still held her scent. With it over his arm, he climbed the stairs toward Emily's room. It was time to truly be a father. 3 weeks had passed since Clara's funeral, and Emily's condition worsened daily. She rarely left her room, and when she did, it was only for the bathroom or to grab something from the kitchen late at night, hoping not to be seen. Richard watched helplessly as his daughter suffered silently. Mrs. Parker continued leaving trays of food by Emily's door 3 times a day, but most returned barely touched. Emily had lost weight, and the circles under her eyes betrayed sleepless nights. "I'm worried, Mr. Calloway," Mrs. Parker said one morning, collecting yet another untouched breakfast tray. She only ate half a slice of toast and drank a bit of milk. That's not healthy for a growing child. Richard ran a hand through his hair, exhausted. He hadn't slept well since Clara's death, torn between work, piling up, and constant concern for Emily. "I've tried everything," he replied, "talking through the door, offering presents, suggesting outings. She just won't answer or says she wants to be alone. Perhaps we need professional help," the housekeeper suggested. "A child psychologist." Richard nodded. "I've made an appointment for next week, but how will I take her if she refuses to leave her room?" That afternoon, he tried again. He knocked softly on Emily's door. "Emily, may I come in? I just want to talk for a bit." Silence. "I brought that adventure book you liked. We could read it together." "I want to be alone," came the weak reply. "Emily, you need to eat properly. Mrs. Parker is worried. I'm worried. I'm not hungry." Richard leaned his forehead against the door, frustrated. He had faced impossible negotiations, convinced skeptical investors, overcome corporate crises, but he couldn't get a 6-year-old to open a door. "Emily, please, go away." The rejection hurt, even though he knew it wasn't personal. Emily was grieving. She'd lost the most important person in her life. Yet every refusal, every locked door, made Richard question if he was doing enough, if he'd ever truly connect with his daughter. The following night, after another failed attempt at communication, Richard sat in his office, reviewing Emily's guardianship papers. Legally, she was his responsibility now, but being a father was more than a legal document. It was about being there, building trust, giving love. He thought of Clara's letter, his mother's interference, the opportunities lost. He thought of Emily, alone in her room, clutching that worn teddy bear, crying for a mother who would never return. An idea came to him. Nothing big, just a small gesture, but maybe a start. Richard took a notepad and wrote a simple message. "I'm here if you need to talk, or just to not be alone. Richard." He folded the paper and slipped it under Emily's door. He didn't expect an answer and got none. But the next day, the note was gone from the floor. He kept sending notes, small messages, clumsy drawings. He was never good at art. Quotes from books Emily liked. Sometimes he wrote about his own day, trivial things like burning breakfast or spotting a strange bird in the garden. A week passed in this one-way communication. Mrs. Parker noticed Emily began eating a little more, not much, but enough to calm immediate worries about her physical health. "The notes are working," the housekeeper remarked, surprised by the simplicity of the approach. Richard wasn't so sure. Emily still didn't talk to him, still didn't leave her room except when necessary. One particularly hard night, after hearing Emily cry for hours, Richard couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed a pillow and blanket from his room and sat in the hallway, leaning against her door. "Emily," he called softly, "I know you're awake. I know you're crying." The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by tense silence. "I'm not asking you to open the door," he continued. "I'm not asking you to talk to me. I just want you to know I'm here." Richard took a deep breath, the next words coming directly from his heart. "I know it hurts, but you're not alone." Silence lasted so long, Richard thought she'd fallen asleep. But then a small, fragile voice responded, "Everybody leaves." Those three simple words carried a world of pain. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the weight of Emily's fear. "I'm not going to leave," he promised. "Mum said she wasn't leaving either," Emily answered, her voice trembling with tears. "She promised she'd get better." Richard felt tears sting his eyes. How could he explain to a child that some promises, no matter how sincere, can't be kept? "Your mum fought so hard to stay with you," he said softly. "She didn't want to go. The illness took her, not a choice. What if you get sick too?" The question was thick with fear. "Emily, I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. That would be a lie. But I can promise that as long as it's up to me, I'll be by your side. And I'm not sick, I'm healthy and strong." No response, just the muffled sound of crying on the other side of the door. "I'm going to stay out here tonight," Richard said, "in case you need anything." He settled on the hard floor, leaning against the wall. It wasn't comfortable, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that Emily knew he was there, that she wasn't alone. Richard woke hours later with a stiff neck and aching back. Morning light filtered through the hallway windows. He stretched, looking at Emily's door, still shut. Standing up with difficulty, he headed to his room for a quick shower before work. When he came back to the hallway, he noticed something different. Emily's door was slightly ajar. Not by much, just a crack, but it was the first time in weeks it wasn't sealed tight. Richard felt a spark of hope, but resisted the urge to enter. Emily was setting the pace, and he had to respect that. In the days that followed, Richard continued slipping notes under the door, along with small gifts. A new book, a piece of chocolate, a flower from the garden. Emily's door remained ajar, though she still rarely came out. Then, on a Sunday afternoon, Richard was walking past the corridor when he heard a sound from her room, a muffled sob that broke his heart. Without hesitating, he knocked softly. "Emily, may I come in?" To his surprise, a quiet reply came. "You can." Richard pushed the door open carefully. The room was dim, the curtains drawn against the daylight. Emily sat on the bed, surrounded by photographs spread across the blanket. She clutched a large photo album against her chest, her face red and streaked with tears. "I found this among Mom's things," she said, pointing to the album. "They're pictures from when I was a baby." Richard approached cautiously and sat on the edge of the bed. "May I see?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then handed him the album. Richard opened it gently, as if holding something infinitely precious. The first page showed Clara in the hospital, holding a newborn baby. She looked exhausted, but her smile radiated pure happiness. The caption read, "Emily Hudson, 7 ladies, 19 inches. The happiest day of my life." Richard felt a lump in his throat. This was a moment he'd never witnessed, the beginning of his daughter's life. "That was the day I was born," Emily said, watching his reaction. Mom said I cried so much the nurse got worried. Richard smiled, imagining the scene. You always did have a strong personality, huh? Turning the pages, they saw Emily growing up. Her first bath, her first smile, her first steps, birthdays, Christmases, ordinary days captured by Clara's camera. In every photo, the love between mother and daughter was clear and overwhelming. This was from a picnic in the park, Emily explained, pointing to a photo of her around 4, smiling with an ice cream smeared face. Mom let me have 2 ice creams that day because I got a good grade at school. Richard listened carefully, soaking up every story, every memory shared. It was like truly meeting his daughter for the first time through these windows into her past. She never told me you were my dad, Emily said after a few pages, but she had a picture of you in her drawer. I saw it once. The comment caught Richard off guard. What did she say about me? That you were very busy and important. That maybe one day I'd meet you. Emily looked at him directly for the first time. She wasn't angry when I asked about you. Just sad. Richard felt a wave of guilt, mixed with enormous gratitude that Clara had never turned Emily against him, even though she had every right to feel hurt. They continued flipping through the album, with Richard asking questions and Emily explaining the photos in impressive detail for a child her age. It was clear these memories were her treasures, her anchors in a world that had crumbled. On the album's last page, there was a recent photo of Clara and Emily together, smiling in front of a blossoming tree. From Clara's appearance, it must have been taken shortly before her health sharply declined. Emily touched her mother's face in the picture, and fresh tears started to roll down her cheeks. I miss her so much, she whispered. Richard couldn't hold back his own tears anymore. I miss her too, he admitted, surprising himself with the truth of it. Emily looked at him, confused. But you weren't together for a long time. No, but your mom was special. She showed me things about life I never noticed before. Richard closed the album gently. And she gave me you, even though I only found out now. He moved closer on the bed and looked into Emily's eyes, so much like his own. Emily, I know we're still getting to know each other. We're still learning how to be a family, but there's one thing I want you to know for certain. He took a deep breath, opening his heart as never before. You are my daughter, and I'm never going to leave you alone again. Emily's face transformed, surprise, relief, and hope all at once. For a moment, she just stared at him, as though testing the honesty of his words. Then suddenly, she threw herself into his arms. Promise, she asked, her voice muffled against his chest. I promise, Richard replied, holding her tight. With all my heart. Emily pulled back slightly to look at him, and for the first time in weeks, a small smile appeared on her face. Mum would like to know we're together now, she said. I'm sure she would, Richard agreed, feeling an unexpected peace. I'm sure she's happy for us, wherever she is. Emily nodded solemnly, then snuggled back into his arms. He held her, amazed at how something so simple could feel so deeply right. In that moment, sitting in the dimly lit room with his daughter finally in his arms, Richard Calloway understood the true meaning of home. It wasn't the luxurious mansion, nor the material possessions he had amassed through years of hard work. Home was this embrace, this trust, this fragile new love blossoming between father and daughter. Emily had finally found in him the father she had always longed for, and Richard, without realizing it until that moment, had found something he hadn't even known he was searching for, a chance at redemption, unconditional love, family. The morning was bright when Richard arrived at his office at Calloway Enterprises. Walking through the corridor, he noticed how the employees looked at him curiously. In the past months, the once feared CEO had become almost unrecognizable. He smiled more, spoke kindly, and, most surprising of all, left work on time. Richard entered his office where Jonathan was already waiting with the day's schedule and a cup of coffee. Good morning, the assistant greeted. How was Emily's presentation yesterday? Richard smiled, opening the folder with pride. She won first place at the science fair. She built a volcano that actually erupted. We made a huge mess in the kitchen preparing the mixture, but it was worth every second. Impressive, Jonathan observed, watching his boss closely. I remember when you cancelled a dinner with the Japanese Prime Minister because the board meeting ran late. Now you're missing meetings to make baking soda volcanoes. Richard shrugged without the slightest regret. Priorities change. Indeed, Jonathan agreed with a smile. The board is waiting in the conference room. They want to discuss the restructuring you proposed. Richard nodded, gathering a few documents. He took a deep breath, preparing for what would surely be a tough meeting. In the past 6 months, he had initiated sweeping changes in the company. Shorter work hours, 2 days of remote work a week, an on-site daycare, extended paternity leave. They're going to push back, he commented, placing papers in his briefcase. Of course they will, Jonathan said, but you've faced tougher situations. Richard smiled, thinking how convincing Emily to eat broccoli could be more challenging than any corporate negotiation. In the conference room, serious faces greeted him. Men and women in impeccable suits, many who had built their careers sacrificing personal life in the name of professional success, exactly as Richard had done for decades. Good morning, everyone, he began, taking his seat at the head of the table. I believe you've all had time to review the proposals I sent last week. We have, replied Marcus Winters, the oldest board member. Frankly, Richard, many of us are worried. These changes mean significant costs and a break from the culture that built this company's success. Richard nodded, not rattled. I understand your concern. That's why I brought some data I'd like to share. He launched his presentation on the screen. Graphs showed that companies with similar policies had higher employee retention, lower turnover, and, surprisingly, increased productivity in the long run. I'm not proposing these changes purely out of idealism, he explained. This is a strategic business decision. Our company has always stood out for innovation, and that requires motivated, well-rested, happy people. Marcus still seemed unconvinced. Richard, you've always been the first to arrive and the last to leave. You built this empire working 7 days a week. And now you want everyone leaving at 5? Richard glanced discreetly at the clock. It was 10:30 a.m. In 3 hours, he needed to leave to pick up Emily from school and take her to piano class. Marcus, you have children, right? The man looked surprised by the question. 3. They're all adults now. When was the last time you watched one of their school performances or took them to the park on a weekday? Marcus frowned. That's irrelevant. My wife took care of that. I was building their future. Richard smiled sympathetically. I used to think exactly like that. I believed professional success and money were the greatest legacy I could leave. He paused. I found out I was wrong. The room fell silent. Richard rarely talked about his personal life and never admitted being wrong. Over the last year, I've learned that time is the most valuable resource we have, and time with the people we love can never be recovered. He turned a slide showing the company's performance from the last 6 months. Notice that since we launched the pilot program in the marketing department, productivity went up 23%. Absenteeism dropped 47%. Employee satisfaction is at record levels. The discussion went on for another hour. Questions, objections, and concerns. Richard addressed them all with the same calm, firm tone. By the end of the meeting, most of the board seemed, if not fully convinced, at least willing to give the new policies a chance. Back in his office, Richard found Jonathan organizing some documents. How did it go? The assistant asked. Better than I expected, Richard replied, putting his materials away. The board approved a 6-month trial for all the policies. Jonathan shook his head in amazement. First, you cut your own salary to fund the corporate daycare. Then you practically force the executives to take vacations. You're unrecognizable. The phrase made Richard pause to reflect. It was true. A year ago, his life revolved exclusively around work. Success was measured in profits, acquisitions, and magazine headlines. His apartment had been merely a place to sleep between workdays. Now his definition of success had changed completely. He felt happy when Emily brought home a drawing from school. He felt accomplished when they finished a puzzle together. His proudest recent moment was when her teacher said Emily seemed more cheerful and outgoing. "Maybe I am unrecognizable," he admitted. "But I'm finally recognizing myself for who I really am." "Well," Jonathan said, checking the time, "if you want to pick Emily up on time, you should leave in 15 minutes. Traffic is bad today." Richard smiled, grateful for the reminder. "I'll finish signing these documents and head out in 10. As he signed the last few papers, Richard thought about how his life had changed since Emily's arrival. The mansion, once silent and spotless, now had fingerprints on the walls, occasional toys lying around and laughter echoing in the corridors. He had turned one of the guest rooms into an art studio for Emily after discovering her talent for drawing. The piano, once only decorative, was now played regularly during her twice-weekly lessons. Richard left the office at the exact time he had planned, leaving behind 3 meetings Jonathan would have to reschedule. In the past, that would have been unthinkable. Now it was the new normal. In the car on his way to the school, he remembered Emily that morning sitting at the breakfast table, animatedly explaining a book they were reading in her literature class. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, and he found himself hanging on every word, every gesture. How had he lived so long without this joy? Arriving at the school, he parked and waited in the designated area for parents. Right at 2 in the afternoon, the bell rang, and kids poured out in loud groups. Richard spotted Emily immediately, wearing the red jacket they'd bought together at the mall, her hair in 2 braids courtesy of Mrs. Parker, who had become a sort of grandmother figure to her. "Dad!" Emily shouted when she saw him running over. Dad. The word still felt both strange and wonderful. Initially, she'd called him Richard, then alternated between the two, until one day it naturally became just Dad. "How was your day?" he asked, crouching to hug her. "Amazing. We got first place in the science fair. My teacher said our volcano was the best she's ever seen. And guess what? Joe invited me to his birthday party next Saturday. Can I go?" Richard smiled at the avalanche of information. "Of course you can. We'll pick out a nice gift for him." On the way to her piano lesson, Emily chattered on about her day gym class, the new girl who'd come from another country and didn't speak the language well, the homework on the solar system. Richard listened attentively, asking questions, laughing at the funny stories, showing genuine interest. It was something he had learned in recent months, how to truly listen, to be present in the moment. Before, even in rare social moments, his mind had always been elsewhere, on some work problem or business strategy. After dropping her off at piano class, Richard used the free hour to go to the mall. Emily had been wanting a book about a girl traveling through space in search of her missing father. The irony wasn't lost on him. A year had passed since Clara's death, a year of transformations, discoveries, challenges, and unexpected joys. Emily's grief still surfaced now and then. She had days when she'd go quiet, looking at photos of her mom, or nights when she woke up from a nightmare. But the sharp pain had turned into something more manageable, a longing that coexisted with the happiness of the present. For Richard, this year had been an awakening. He'd discovered abilities he never knew he had. Patience in teaching Emily to ride a bike, creativity in making up bedtime stories, strength to stay calm during tantrums, tenderness to dry tears after nightmares. When he returned to pick Emily up from her lesson, he found her chatting happily with her teacher, Mrs. Blackwell, an older woman with nimble hands and a gentle smile. "Mr. Calloway," the teacher greeted. "Emily is making remarkable progress. She has a great ear and a lot of dedication." Richard felt that flush of paternal pride that still surprised him with its intensity. "She practices every day without me having to remind her." "Music was important to my mom," Emily explained, gathering her sheet music. "When I play, I feel like she's listening." Richard and Mrs. Blackwell exchanged understanding glances. The teacher knew Emily's situation and often served as additional emotional support. On the drive home, Emily asked to stop by the park. It was their Friday tradition, an hour at the playground before heading back to the mansion. Richard, who once counted every minute of his day, now cherished this unplanned time, watching Emily run, swing, and make new friends with an ease only children possess. While she played on the slide, he received a call from his mother. After their argument about Clara, they'd gone months without speaking. The reconciliation had been slow and was still ongoing, but Eleanor was trying to connect with her granddaughter and respect Richard's decisions. "I just wanted to confirm Sunday lunch," she said. "I'm making that chocolate cake Emily liked last time." "We'll be there," Richard confirmed. "Emily's excited to show you the new trick she taught the stray dog we adopted." Eleanor laughed. "I still can't believe you, of all people, now have a dog in your immaculate mansion." "Things change, Mom," he answered, watching Emily wave at him from atop the slide. "For the better." When they got home, Mrs. Parker greeted them with the smell of lasagna in the air. The housekeeper, who once maintained a strictly professional relationship with Richard, was now practically part of the family, often eating dinner with them and playing an active role in Emily's upbringing. Dinner was always Richard's favorite time of day. Sitting at the kitchen table, the formal dining room was rarely used now, they shared stories, planned for the weekend, sometimes played board games or watched a movie together. That particular evening, after Mrs. Parker said goodnight and went to her room, Richard and Emily stayed in the living room. She was drawing while he reviewed a few reports. "Dad?" Emily called, looking up from her sketch. "Yes?" "Tomorrow marks 1 year since Mom went to heaven." Richard set the papers aside immediately. "Yes, it does. Do you want to do something special to remember her?" Emily thought for a moment. "Could we go to the botanical gardens? She loved flowers." "Of course we can. We'll take a picnic." Emily smiled, returning to her drawing. Richard watched her quietly, struck by her resilience, her ability to honor the sadness without being consumed by it. Later, as he tucked her into bed, Emily asked him to share a story about her mother. "How did you two meet?" she asked, snuggling under the covers. Richard sat on the edge of the bed and recounted the hospital story, how Clara had challenged him when no one else dared, how she laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, how she saw beauty in things he'd never noticed. "She knew you'd be a good dad," he finished, "even when I didn't know it myself." Emily yawned. And she was right. As Richard stood to leave, Emily caught his hand. "Sometimes I get sad because I miss Mom," she said softly, "but I'm also happy I have you now." A lump formed in his throat. "I'm happy I have you too, Emily. More than you can imagine." She squeezed his hand and looked at him with serious eyes. "Now I'm sure you're the best daddy in the world." Richard felt tears burn his eyes. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. "And you're the best daughter anyone could wish for." "Good night, my love." "Good night, Dad," she replied, her eyes already drifting shut. Richard turned off the main light, leaving only the small lamp on, and gently closed the door. In the hallway, he leaned against the wall for a moment, overwhelmed by an emotion so intense he could barely contain it. 1 year ago, he was Richard Calloway, feared CEO, business magnate, a solitary man in an empty mansion. Today, he was simply Dad, and he realized it was the most important title he had ever held. As he walked to his own bedroom, Richard thought of Clara and all she had given him, even after she was gone. Thanks to her, he finally understood that his greatest wealth was not in his bank account or his company's shares. It was in human connections, in unconditional love, in the family he now formed with Emily. Perhaps, he thought, that was what Clara had always tried to show him, that life, with all its complications, uncertainties and challenges, was infinitely richer when shared with the people we love. Richard Calloway fell asleep that night, with a smile on his face, a man completely different from the one who had opened the door for a little unexpected visitor a year ago. A man made whole at last,